Remember when they announced they were making a new David Copperfield film starring Dev Patel, and some people got kind of mad that the casting wasn't accurate to the original book, and then the film came out and the film changed almost everything about the book and nobody said a thing. It's almost as if what they cared about wasn't accuracy to the book at all, but something else entirely. The fact is, no one really cares about the book David Copperfield. It doesn't have the same draw as Oliver Twist or Great Expectations. People know it exists, but most haven't really read it, and if they have, most of the plot is kind of forgettable. Probably because it's a 600-page long self-insert fanfiction about Charles Dickens himself. I really didn't like the book. You might say that I hated it, but the film, oh my gosh. I don't know how he did it, but Dev Patel made a character that was as bland as your grandmother's DVD collection into someone fun and, dare I say, likeable. The reason why I hated the book so much is that there's so many plot lines and characters that I wish were different, which is why I like the film, because it fixed a lot, if not all of the problems I had with the original book. But don't worry friends, it does not replace the source material. It simply exists in a parallel universe to the original book. Let me explain. The novel David Copperfield is basically Charles Dickens writing about himself. Charles Dickens and David Copperfield both grew up without fathers. They both went to work in a workhouse where they were mistreated. They are both weirdly drawn towards their older sister figures. They have a fascination with names and aliases. They both worked as clerics, and they both went on to become famous and successful novelists. Now, it's not fair to say that David Copperfield is Charles Dickens' exact life, because that's not true. But the novel is certainly semi-autobiographical. And Dickens definitely writes himself and some of his experiences into the character. And if the book is just a semi-autobiographical alternative universe to Dickens' life, then the film is just a second, further alternate universe. So you have Charles Dickens writing book David Copperfield. Then you have book David Copperfield writing film David Copperfield, and then film David Copperfield writing the next generation of David Copperfield. And the cycle just continues repeating until we presumably get Dickens' actual autobiography. So let's get into it. If you haven't read it, the book is a Bildungsroman, which means it tracks David's life from birth to adulthood, like a coming-of-age movie, except longer and with mild scenes of child abuse. The film starts with adult David narrating his own birth, which, I'm not gonna lie, gave me a very visceral reaction. It really felt like this poor woman was going through the most unbearable pain of her entire life, and David was stoically watching it like a nature documentary, and he had to sit on the sidelines and just let nature take its course. Then we flash to David as a young child, who is leaving his mother to spend the weekend with Peggotty, the lovable maid. He isn't told why, but there is definitely nothing strange going on here. People send their kids to go away with the maid for overnight trips all the time. I'm sure of it. There he meets his maid's working-class fishing family. They live in an upside-down boat.
It's a downside, upside, capsized boat.
And their main hobbies include gutting fish and talking about gutting fish. There's a lot of characters here because the book was written by Dickens, and he's the compulsive need to introduce someone new every 20 pages, and their names are either something like Jack Maldon or Mealy Potatoes. But I'm only going to talk about Ham and Little Emily, because everyone else is pretty by the book. Ham and Emily are not related, but they are both looked after by Peggotty's brother, Mr. Peggotty. Their parents both died from drowning, and you can hardly tell because of how subtly they mention it, but drowning is a key theme and will come back later.
Are Emily your children?
No, they're adopted. Both their fathers was drowned.
Ham has the personality of the food he was named after, and is the straight-laced, conventional, nice man who enjoys his simple lifestyle of gutting fish and being happy, while Emily is a bit more wild. She likes to walk toe-to-toe in the harbour, and like all angsty teens, her goal is to leave this town and marry whoever the Victorian version of Pete Wentz was. In the book, she is called Little Emily because when we first meet her, she is a child and therefore little. But it's different in the film because she is a grown-up and should therefore be referred to as average-size Emily. Then Ham and Emily announce their engagement, and the movie version of David is very delighted.
Are you
Getting engaged?
getting engaged?
Just say getting engaged.
We're engaged.
In the books, this didn't happen until much later because Emily was still a child and that would be illegal. But it adds some more credence on my infinite Copperfield parallel universe theory because the scene is interrupted by a giant hand letting us know that this is not how the engagement happened, but it is how David is choosing to write it. The hand takes us in a balled fist and carries us back to child David, who has returned home to find his mother has secretly gotten married to the owner of the hand, Mr. Murdstone. David is obviously very unhappy about his new stepfather and his mother's taste in men, and certainly regrets his words earlier.
Everybody should get married.
Maybe they shouldn't, Davy. Maybe they shouldn't. Mr. Murdstone also has an evil sister called Miss Murdstone, who's just him but the girl version. Like in cartoons when they introduce a girl character and she dresses the same as a boy, except she has like a bow in her hair or like long eyelashes or something. Miss Murdstone gives the sickest burns.
I regret I missed the wedding and the chance to meet you at the peak of your beauty.
And is an all-round monster. So as his stepfather, Mr. Murdstone immediately wants to give David an education, which sounds nice until you realise his teaching method is just to bring David into a room and have everyone stare at him until he memorises words on the page.
Sometime today, boy.
Naturally, David messes up from the stress of being watched like a zoo animal. Now in the book, this happens a few times with Mr. Murdstone trying to get David to read and David getting really anxious and messing up. But in the film, it only takes once for the two to come to blows. Mr. Murdstone goes to hit David and David retaliates by taking a bite of his hand,
Indeed.
which is an oddly satisfying sound effect. Some people are thick-skinned, but Mr. Murdstone has the skin of a ripe apple. I didn't notice when I went to see this in cinema back in February, because children being hurt is something that I hate watching, but David also throws a bedpan onto Mr. Murdstone, which I thought was kind of fun. Germ theory was still being disputed in the medical community then, so if David broke skin from the bite, and it sounds like he did, then whatever's in the bedpan is going to give Mr. Murdstone's immune system a nice surprise, isn't it? Then we get the first major change from the book. In the book, Murdstone is so mad at David that he sends him off to boarding school. He's in the boarding school for a few years, then goes to work for a wine merchant. But the movie didn't want to build another set, I guess, so they just skipped the boarding school altogether. Go straight to the wine.
Look at the writing on his back. What's he say?
Then we get to the only change in the film that I did not like. In the book, David is a child at boarding school, and he comes home from the holidays to see his mother has given birth to a baby. She's sick and dying of the same thing that Padme died of in Star Wars. A combination of sadness, angry husbands, and really questionable robotic midwives. He returns to school and is there for a few days when he hears that his mother is dead. And that's when he is shipped off to the workhouse we see in the film. But in the film, he's an adult when he finds out his mother is dead, and in retaliation, destroys the whole factory. I didn't like this change as much because in the book, after his mother's death, he decides to go and find his estranged aunt, and it seems like a much bigger deal than it is in the film. Running away as a child to traverse Victorian England looking for your long lost aunt on your own would be difficult, and in the book David was still pretty young. Now David's age is unclear at this part of the film, but he certainly reads like an adult or like an older teenager, and I feel that Dev Patel can handle himself on his own without the help of a mysterious aunt, but maybe that's just me. The aunt in question is one Betsy Trotwood, as played by Tilda Swinton, who lives with her dear friend Mr. Dick. Mr. Dick is a very lovely man, but he has a hyperfixation on Charles I, believing that when the king was executed, Charles's thoughts went into his own head.
Sorry,
King Charles's head.
yes. Owing to a disagreement, they cut it off.
In 1649, that's well documented.
Is it? Well, for reasons that I don't fully understand, they decided to remove the troubling thoughts in his head and put them into mine.
To deal with Charles I's thoughts, he has them written down and scattered about the room, as if to make some sort of sense or semblance of them. Upon arriving, David immediately offers to help Mr. Dick by offering to help him gather his thoughts, by suggesting tying all pieces of paper onto a kite and having the kite fly away with the thoughts of Charles I. I'm not 100% sure of the methodology here. Something about the wind collecting the thoughts of Charles I, or the thoughts floating away. But it was Victorian England, so we'll work with the limited therapy tools we have. Anyway, we get the sense that Mr. Dick isn't always treated well by other people because of his disability. Just like Aunt Betsy isn't treated well because she's left her husband to live an unmarried life in the country. So because David is accepting of all people, his aunt allows him to stay with her. In the books, since David was a child at this point, the kite thing is a nice contrast between the house and the House of the Murdstones. Mr. Murdstone really hated all of David's imagination games and stories, but they are really relished with his aunt and Mr. Dick. Which brings us to another character reveal. I'm sorry, I know, there are already so many, but just bear with me. We meet Mr. Wickfield, a lawyer and manager of Betsy Trotwood's estate, and his daughter, Agnes. Ooh. They take lunch together, and there's a close-up of Mr. Wickfield's face as a globe filled with booze is wheeled out the room by a maid who's in no real rush, which could either be a subtle allusion for Mr. Wickfield's need for alcohol, or signal his crippling fear of globes. His Aunt Betsy sends him off to boarding school, where he meets teenage, emo, Pete Wentz wannabe Steerforth. In the film, they're both adults, but their first meeting in the book was as kids, at the first boarding school David was supposed to go to. My favourite part is when they start roasting Uriah Heep, the suspiciously creepy clerk, after he leaves the room, and he just slowly walks behind them. Not just because he obviously heard them, but because it means when he first left the room, he went the opposite way and had to double bag.
Where's the dormitory, please?
I'm in deep humility.
And with that, Uriah Heep rubbed himself out of the room.
He twitches his mouth like a curious lizard.
Yes, it does. Tell me another.
He stands so close by that he's nearer to you than your own shirt.
Yes.
David discovers that making fun of people is how to be cool in school. In the book, this was a lot of peer pressure, and you had a lot of sympathy for David because he was a child. He's known these boys 2 seconds, and already he's trying to fit in by making fun of everybody around him. David, you're 32. Stop harassing people for no reason and go out and get a job. In the book, Steerforth, who is a teenager, calls David Daisy because he's so innocent and fresh. But it really reads different when they're adults, and they have this seemingly intimate moment until the secondary character speaks, and you're vaguely aware that he was there the whole time just watching this interaction and saying nothing.
I'm glad you've arrived. Nice cousin, that waistcoat. The very daisy in the field is not fresher than you are. I shall call you Daisy. Will you mind?
Not at all.
Why on earth would you?
Steerforth then asks David to read to him, and it leads to David telling the story of his life. But there are some changes, like him slapping Mr. Murdstone and maiming Miss Murdstone by hilariously causing her permanent disfigurement.
Is there vengeance in that?
Wait for it.
I think this lends a bit of credence to my theory that there is a David Copperfield multiverse, where every story David tells features another David telling a different, slightly embellished story. A few days later, David and Steerforth get into this fist fight, and I'm not sure why. It's portrayed as a big event here, but in my school we just called it a Thursday afternoon. Then David wakes up with way more blood on him than he has cuts, which is vaguely alarming, but not to worry, Agnes is there to clean up his wounds. Ooh. Truthfully, in the book, Agnes has the personality of a spoon, but in the film, she and David not only get along, but they might even have chemistry. Until this happens.
And I think of you as a sister.
In fairness, according to Dickens, that's the highest compliment you can give a woman. But she gets her revenge because Uriah Heep, the weird clerk from earlier, asks David to lunch.
As to ask you to come to tea with me and Mother.
Jane, I fear I have a prior engagement on that date.
On which date? I don't believe I mentioned the date.
I don't believe you did.
No. I'll be glad to come, Mr. Heath.
Uriah, please. Mother, we'll go up like a rocket. On the 14th, perhaps, at 4. And if Miss Whitfield would care to...
Sadly, on the 14th at 4, I have a prior engagement.
Of course, I'm meant to join you in that engagement, am I not, Agnes?
I don't believe so, no.
Now, I don't think this is groundbreaking. They do this sort of banter in movies all the time. But do you know what? It's better than anything we got in the book, which was nothing. We got nothing. Agnes is nothing. Who is Agnes? I don't even know. Didn't even remember till I watched the film. That's how bland she was. We then skip forward to a sort of graduation event, and you can see the evil clerk subtly trying to get Mr. Wickfield drunk. This is where David first sees Dora. She is a grown woman who talks to her dog like it's a person, and if she were alive today, she would have been one of those teenagers that take it upon themselves to meow in class. David and Dora start dating, and it's all very pleasant, but you get the feeling that she's not the one that he's going to end up with. Months later, David goes to play with Steerforth and the lads, gets a bit drunk, and runs into Agnes, Mr. Wickfield, and Uriah Heep, the evil clerk. Except he's not an evil clerk anymore. He's been promoted to evil apprentice in a bid to try and usurp Mr. Wickfield from his own job. We then have another subtle hint as to how Mr. Wickfield could have let this happen.
Nothing for me, just the wine.
Then David's aunt shows up, and it turns out she has lost her fortune and her house because Uriah Heep, professional evil clerk, has taken over Mr. Wickfield's firm entirely. It's sad, but David takes the time to take a brief vacation with Steerforth to the boathouse from the start of the film. We discover Ham and Emily are still engaged, and Ham's ambition is to move half a mile away from the boathouse, and Emily is, well, she's not having it. Next 18, Steerforth and Emily flirt while cutting up fish. Then Steerforth takes David out to a bar and insists he thinks of him at his best.
Did you have enough money to pay for the drinks?
Plenty.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Promise me, Daisy, won't you? That you will think of me at my best. Promise me that much.
We get another weird moment where it seems like David and Steerforth are having a very quiet, intimate conversation, but then Steerforth stands up and there's an entire bar filled with people.
Where did sudden cloud come from?
Who's over Ashanti?
Then Steerforth lives up to his wannabe Pete Wentz potential by starting to sing. Also, can we just get more singing in movies, like particularly singing in the pubs? It's really very fun. The next night, they find a letter that says Emily has run off with Steerforth. Emily believes Steerforth will make her a lady by marrying her, but you can probably tell that that's not going to happen. After taking a very long 5 seconds to care about where Emily is, David quickly moves on with his life and proposes to Dora. Dora then goes to talk to David's Aunt Betsy, who strongly hints at the fact that David and Dora aren't compatible and their marriage will be a gigantic mistake. The reason being is that Dora acts like a 5-year-old and, well, David just acts like a normal adult. They really have nothing in common, and their relationship makes everyone around them visibly sick. But Dora, who has all the self-awareness of a blueberry scone, is still not getting it. The film then flashes to David writing his novel about the evil clerk and how Agnes hopes to save the day. All the characters storm into Uriah Heep's new office. David and Agnes go first to intimidate, and then Aunt Betsy and Mr. Dick a few seconds later. Finally, Mr. Wickfield emerges from behind the curtain, where I can only assume he has been stood behind since morning. Evil law partner Uriah says it feels like a party, but Mr. Wickfield does not, and does some jazz hands, presumably to show he's sober enough to reclaim his company. Uriah Heep continues to insult everyone around him in a blind panic. He hasn't seen this many characters before since Avengers Infinity War, which he gave a 6.5 out of 10 on IMDb. He enjoyed it, he just wanted to be humble about it. Uriah sarcastically asks if anyone else wants to accuse him, and Mr. Micawber and Pegotty appear. It turns out they were also standing behind the door, waiting for their cue. I realise I didn't have time to explain who Mr. Micawber is. He's basically like Steve Martin from Cheaper by the Dozen. He has like 10 million kids, and he has like a lot of wacky hijinks. And that's really all you need to know. They're basically accusing Uriah of embezzling funds and forging Mr. Wickfield's signature, which he did. Naturally, Mr. Wickfield is angry that the firm has been taken from him, and so gives his ex-clerk a very specific insult,
1,000 curses upon you! I take it back! 1,004!
which is the same amount of glasses of wine he had while waiting behind that curtain all day. Evil law partner decides now is the best time for a proposal.
Agnes, if you have any love for your babbling partner, you'll leave this gang and marry me.
Then we get this scene. Just when this is seeming a little too perfect, a bit too orchestrated, Dora, who wasn't in the scene before and did not get a dramatic entrance, suddenly emerges. It turns out this was partially David's imagination, as he continued to embellish the details of his own life, for his own take on the David Copperfield mythology. Dora wasn't in the confrontation, and she realises what Aunt Betsy was telling her before. She doesn't fit in with David. They are too different. We see David scribble out Dora's interaction, implying he's written her out the scene and his own life. This is absolutely 100% my favourite change from the book, and it will be yours too when I explain it. In the book, David and Dora do end up getting married. She acknowledges her immaturity and continually calls herself a child wife. 26 times she says that, and not once does she or David think about how it sounds, which really shows she has absolutely no self-awareness, and unlike the film, in the book she never gets any. Instead, in the book, David decides to try and change her. He gets really frustrated and angry with her and tries to shape her personality so it's less childlike. But it doesn't work, because yelling at someone to change their personality doesn't really do much. Something David should really have experience with.
I'm very stupid.
You'd as soon as take the furniture.
Jane Murdstone,
Not
silence!
stupid, it's just a little
Clara Murdstone, silence!
Instead of Dora leaving David like in the film, Dora instead becomes pregnant. Now, I do not believe in slut-shaming, except in this instance, because David, you shouldn't be doing anything above hand-holding with a woman that calls herself a child wife. What is wrong with you, mate? Don't worry, she and the baby immediately die of the same thing that killed Padme and David's mother. A combination of sadness, angry husbands, and really questionable robotic midwives. I hated this in the book. Like, one of the reasons I hate David Copperfield so much is because of this part. First of all, introducing the character that acts like a child is fair enough, but David getting mad at her for being like a child when he was drawn to the fact that she acted like a child is ridiculous. Secondly, David has been on the opposite end of this. David's mother was married to someone who tried to change her and eventually caused her death. By marrying and trying to change Dora, he basically causes her death too. He subconsciously took inspiration from his first father figure, Mr. Murdstone, and attempted to become teacher and wife to Dora. It's a horrible cycle of abuse that's never mended, and you're expecting me to root for this character? Root for him to love again? To marry his next victim? I don't think so. Thankfully, in the film, Dora has what she should have always had. Agency. She doesn't marry David because she realised it was a mistake and she doesn't want to get pregnant and die. The bar is literally so low, but I've never been more thankful. Back to the film. Dora has just run out of David's office, presumably to go into witness protection. Then Peggotty runs in with news that they have found average-size Emily. Tragically, Steerforth isn't with her, and to absolutely no one's surprise, they never got married. We have a flashback to Steerforth abandoning Emily while looking cool and edgy on a horse.
I'm no good for anyone. Think of me at my best.
He said the same "think of me at my best" line to David, but I'm wondering when exactly is his best. When he was a high school popular kid making fun of everyone? When he watched David get into a fist fight? When he ran off with Emily? When he sang a jaunty tune in the pub? Oh no wait, I did enjoy that. I actually did really enjoy that. Yeah, great. That's how I remember you, Steerforth. They get Emily back, but they're told that Steerforth is due to arrive back by boat that very night on a blustery, stormy sea. Wonder what kind of things can happen in a blustery, stormy sea. The ensemble go to the beach, where chaos is ensuing, and Ham, Emily's fiancé, decides to swim out to the boat to help. He sees Steerforth, the man who ran away with Emily, and tries to save his life. but alas, Steerforth refuses, deciding to steer forth right into a wave that knocks him into the perilous ocean below. He dies. Ham is okay though. Not in the book. In the book, Ham did not make it. Actually, in the book, no one knew Steerforth was on the boat. Ham just saw a boat needing help and ran off to do his good Christian duty to help out. But they both ended up dying, so it seemed kind of pointless anyway. By letting Ham live, the film obviously changes the major point of the book. But as soon as that happens, it flashes forward to David reading his writing aloud in front of the audience we saw him reading to at the start of the film. This implies again that these aren't the facts, but more David's embellished version of events. The film ends with shots of this hazy but fun reunion in a field, where various characters and objects that were significant earlier make a reappearance. This is pretty much how the book ends, with David narrating what happened to everyone after the story. But the film gives us this bonus scene, where David has a vision of himself as a child and tells him not to worry. We can only assume that this child, David, represents the next generation in the David Copperfield mythology. So there you have it. Charles Dickens writes a semi-autobiographical novel, creating the character of David Copperfield and giving that character the power to create multiple alternate David Copperfield adjacent universes. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you to everyone who was so nice about the last video. I'm honestly ecstatic that you enjoyed it, because I was really nervous uploading it, and so it really means a lot. And I hope you enjoyed this one too. It feels a little less relevant because the film came out in February, which both feels like a month and 10 years ago. But I hope you enjoy it anyway. But yeah, let me know what you think, and I will see you soon.